Hello, my name is Carrie Brown and I'm with Central Mississippi Regional Library System. Today I'm going to be reading to you chapters 5, 6, and 7 of A to Z Mysteries, The Unwilling Umpire. Written by Ron Roy, illustrated by John Stephen Gurney, published by Random House, New York. Chapter 5. Who's Marion Unkenholes? Asked Josh. I wonder if she's related to Pete, Dink said. I think Marion is a man's name, Mrs. McElroy said. The female Marion has an A instead of an O. Ruth Rose glanced at the monitor again. The reporter who wrote the story is Susan Green. Maybe she knows this Marion Unkenholes. Could we call her? Mrs. McElroy picked up her phone and dialed information. She asked for the Coast Press in Penobscot, wrote down the number, and handed the phone to Ruth Rose. Ruth Rose punched in the number, then listened. A second later, she asked to speak to Susan Green. After a pause, she said, Well, is there anyone else who can tell me anything about Marion Unkenholes? Your paper reported that he stole a van. Ruth Rose waited and then listened to someone else. It is? She said. Oh, well, thank you. Ruth Rose handed the telephone back to Mrs. McElroy. Susan Green moved to California, she said, but I spoke with another reporter. He remembered the stolen van because his sister works in Sugar's Bakery. Did you find out if Pete is related to Marion? Josh asked. Ruth Rose nodded. Pete is Marion, she said. Huh? Said Josh. The reporter said the thief's full name is Marion Peter Unkenholes, Ruth Rose said. I guess he goes by Pete. Dink just blinked at the news. He felt numb. Could it be a different Pete Unkenholes? He asked. Josh grinned. Yeah, like there are a bunch of Unkenholeses running around in that place in Maine. I'm sorry you had to get this bad news, Mrs. McElroy said. She took her purse from a drawer. You're welcome to stay, but I have to get some lunch now. Us too, Josh said. He looked at Dink and Ruth Rose. Okay, Dink said. I don't know what else we can do. Well, I have an idea, Ruth Rose said. The kids thanked Mrs. McElroy and left the library. Does your idea have anything to do with lunch? Josh asked Ruth Rose. I'm so hungry I could eat a spider. Ruth Rose headed down West Green Street. Dink and Josh shrugged, then followed her across Main Street. Where are we going? Dink asked. To the river, Ruth Rose said, heading past the empty baseball field. I want to check out Pete's trailer. Why? Asked Josh. Because I don't believe Pete is the kind of person who would take someone's van for a joyride, Ruth Rose said. But you just told us that reporter said Pete did it, Josh said. Ruth Rose shook her head. I just have a feeling there has to be some other explanation, she said. I guess I agree, Dink said. It almost seems like Pete is two different people. The kids followed a sunny path toward the river. In a clearing, they saw picnic tables and fireplaces. Only one campsite was occupied. Under a tree was a small white trailer, the kind you pull behind a car or truck. A few yards away, the Indian River sparkled in the sunlight. Cool trailer, Josh whispered. It would be fun to sleep here. You could fish from your bed. 3 aluminum steps led up to a door. Under a window was a lawn chair. A red and blue flannel shirt was draped over its back. The spot was quiet except for bird calls and squirrels scampering in the leaves. Josh picked up the shirt, then put it back on the chair. How do we know if this is Pete's trailer? He asked. Dink walked around the trailer. I think it is, he said. Look at this. Josh and Ruth Rose followed him. Dink pointed to the license plate. It was from Maine. Josh walked up the steps and rapped on the door. Anybody home? He called. When no one answered, he tried the doorknob. Locked, he said. Dink stood on the lawn chair and tried to look through the window next to the door. There's a curtain, he said. Ruth Rose walked over to the picnic table. There was a trash barrel and a small stone fireplace with a grill for cooking. A long-handled fork was resting on the edge of the fireplace. Ruth Rose picked up the fork and poked at the stuff in the trash barrel. Hungry? Josh cracked, walking toward her with Dink. Ruth Rose stuck the fork into a small box and pulled it out of the barrel. On the side of the box was a picture of a man sneezing. Below the picture were the words, Allergreen, fast relief from grass allergies. Chapter 6. Pete wasn't faking his allergies, Dink said. So he was going into the clubhouse for his medicine, Josh said. We have to show this to Officer Fallon, Ruth Rose said, shoving the box into her pocket. The kids ran almost all the way to the police station. They hurried up the front steps and down the cool hallway and knocked on Officer Fallon's door. Come in, he said. When the kids entered, Officer Fallon was just hanging up the phone. Hey, kids, the police chief said. Looks like you've been running. Have a seat and catch your breath. Ruth Rose put the allergreen box on his desk, and the kids sat down. We found that at the campsite, she said. This proves Pete really does have allergies. Officer Fallon held up a large hand. Whoa, slow down, he said, smiling at Ruth Rose. What campsite? We found out Pete is living in a trailer at the campground, Dink explained, so we went there, and Ruth Rose found this box in the trash. Officer Fallon picked up the box. As he read the print, the kids explained how they'd found the article about Pete on the internet. We found out he... Josh stopped and looked guilty. What, Josh? Officer Fallon said. What were you going to say? Well, we found out that Pete stole a van, Josh said. Officer Fallon set the medicine box on his desk. Anything else? He asked. His first name is really Marion, Ruth Rose went on. He comes from Penobscot, Maine. I called the paper, and a reporter told me his middle name is Peter. Officer Fallon rubbed his chin. You've been busy, he said. We don't think Pete stole anything, Ruth Rose said. We think he went inside to get his medicine, not to steal Mr. Pocket's baseballs, Dink added. Or maybe the medicine made a good excuse to go into the clubhouse, Officer Fallon said. Remember, Pete confessed to taking the balls. Officer Fallon stood up and walked over to his office window. Why would he confess to something he didn't do? He asked over his shoulder. He might have seen another person in the clubhouse, Josh volunteered. Maybe he's protecting someone. Maybe. All I know is Pete is unwilling to talk to me, Officer Fallon said. He's shut up like a clam. How long will Pete have to stay in jail? Ruth Rose asked. The chief sighed and slumped into his chair. I'm afraid Pete could go to prison for a very long time, he said. No one said anything for a minute. What if we found the baseballs? Dink asked. If Mr. Pocket got them back, could Pete get out of jail? A judge would have to decide that, Officer Fallon said. There will be a trial. I've been trying to get a lawyer for Pete. Did you find one? Dink asked. Yes, Officer Fallon said. He tapped a pencil against the allergreen box. But when I asked Pete, he said he wouldn't speak to her. Chapter 7. But why not? Josh asked. Officer Fallon shook his head. I wish I knew, he said. If anyone ever needed a good lawyer, Pete does. Could we visit Pete? Dink asked. We could try to convince him to talk to the lawyer. Officer Fallon gazed at Dink across his desk. We have nothing to lose, he said finally. I'll take you through to his cell for a few minutes. Explain to Pete that he needs a lawyer. The kids followed Officer Fallon out of his office, along a hallway and down a set of stairs. At the bottom, Officer Fallon opened a steel door. Behind the door was a large windowless room. In one corner, iron bars formed a small cell. Inside the cell, Pete Unkenholes sat on a chair staring at his feet. I brought you some company, Officer Fallon said. He nodded at the kids and left the room. Pete looked up. He licked his lips but didn't say anything. His eyes looked scared. How are you? Ruth Rose asked. Pete shrugged. Fine, he said in a soft voice. Do you have your allergy medication? Dink asked. Pete nodded his head toward a box of allergreen that stood on a small table. Officer Fallon really wants to help you, Josh said. He found you a good lawyer. Will you talk to her? Pete licked his lips again. Look, I appreciate your coming, but I already told them I took the balls, he said. But you need a lawyer, Ruth Rose said, and we don't think you took those baseballs, even if you said you did. Pete's eyes widened, but he didn't say anything. When you went to the clubhouse for your medicine, did you see anyone else there? Josh asked. Pete shook his head. I stole the baseballs, he muttered. But why won't you tell Officer Fallon where they are? Dink asked. And why won't you talk to the lawyer? Pete twisted in his chair so his back was to the kids. Please just go away, he said over his shoulder. After a few seconds, the kids left. They walked back to Officer Fallon's office. Any luck? The police chief asked. He told us to go away, said Josh. Thanks for trying, Officer Fallon said. Maybe Pete just needs more time to think. The kids left the police station and headed toward Main Street. Now I'm really confused, Ruth Rose said. It's almost like Pete wants to stay in jail. Something else has been bugging me, Josh said. If Pete did steal the balls, why didn't he just hide them, then come back to the game? By leaving the way he did, he practically pointed a finger at himself. Ruth Rose rubbed her temples. My brain is tired, she said. Your brain needs peanut butter, Josh said. It's a scientific fact that when your brain is stuck, you need something even stickier to get it unstuck. Peanut butter. Dink and Ruth Rose both shoved Josh, but they were hungry, so they followed him to his house on Farm Lane. Josh's mother was in the kitchen, still dressed in shorts and sneakers. She was looking through the window at Josh's younger brothers in the backyard. You made a great catch today, Mrs. Pinto, Ruth Rose said. Josh's mother smiled at the kids. It was just luck, she said. The ball came right to me. Any news about Mr. Pocket's baseballs? The kids quickly told her what they'd learned about Pete. Goodness, Josh's mother said. Pete Unkenholes seems like the most honest person in the world. She headed out of the room. Will you watch the boys while I shower? She asked Josh. Sure, and we're going to make sandwiches, okay? Josh asked. Okay, and send your brothers in for their lunch in a few minutes, his mother said as she climbed the stairs. Josh made thick peanut butter sandwiches while Dink and Ruth Rose found the milk in 3 glasses. They ate outside at the picnic table. Josh's twin brothers were playing with his dog Pal on the lawn. The 2 4-year-olds were tugging on one end of an old t-shirt. The other end was in Pal's mouth. The boys laughed and yelled. Pal growled and tossed his head back and forth. All 3 were covered with dirt. Mom's going to flip out when she sees what you're doing with your shirt, Josh yelled. It isn't our shirt, Brian yelled back. It's yours, Bradley chimed in. Both boys burst into giggles and went running after Pal. Dink and Ruth Rose laughed. Bye-bye shirt, Dink said. Probably one of my favorites, too, Josh muttered. Then he jumped up and nearly spilled his milk. Guys, there was a shirt at Pete's trailer, he said, outside on that chair. We saw the shirt, Ruth Rose said, licking peanut butter off her fingers. So? I picked it up, Josh went on. At the time, I didn't think anything about it. But now I realize that shirt is way too small to fit Pete. It must belong to someone else. Like who? Dink asked. I don't know, Josh said. But if Pete's not talking, maybe we can talk to whoever owns that shirt. If we can find him, Dink said. Or her, Ruth Rose added. Pal might be able to help, Josh said. He whistled and his dog came trotting from behind the barn, quickly followed by Brian and Bradley. Pal flopped on the ground and plopped both front paws on top of the wet, filthy shirt. Mom wants you guys inside for lunch, and you better wash your hands, Josh told Brian and Bradley. They're gross. They're clean, Bradley said. He and his brother held up 4 dirty hands. Josh leaned toward his little brothers. Mom's making you a surprise for lunch, he whispered. Yay! Screamed Brian, heading for the door. Wait up, yelled Bradley as he raced after his brother. Come on, Josh said to Dink and Ruth Rose. He clipped Pal's leash onto his collar and tossed the ruined t-shirt onto the picnic table. Then they all headed back to the campsite. 5 minutes later, they saw the trailer. Pal spotted a squirrel and began barking and tugging on the leash. The squirrel dashed up a tree as the kids approached the trailer. Nobody's here, Ruth Rose said, glancing around the clearing. Well, someone has been, Josh said, pointing to the lawn chair. The shirt is gone. Thank you. Be sure to tune in next week for chapters 8, 9, and 10. Goodbye.